Nonviolence section, Democratic Interventionism or Democratization of International Relations. We certainly need to bear in mind the new developments that have occurred in the interim. In the wake of the two catastrophic world wars, first the League of Nations and then the United Nations organization emerged. There are radical differences between the two. The first did not even mask its adhesion to the ideology and practice of colonialism. Two articles in particular were revealing. Article 21 consecrated the legitimacy of the Monroe Doctrine, which, in Theodore Roosevelt's reinterpretation some years earlier, conferred international police power on the United States in Latin America, thereby reduced it to the rank of a colony or semi-colony of the North American Big Brother. The Article 22 attributed to the powers victorious in the First World War the mandate or sacred task of guiding peoples who had not yet reached the level of modern civilization. Thus, great power chauvinism and the principle of inequality between civilized and barbarous nations were officially consecrated. Democracy in international relations was rendered impossible by an ill-concealed censitary discrimination, whereby only nations approximating to modern civilization, the developed wealthy ones, had the right to a voice. Created and progressively enlarged while a worldwide anti-colonial revolution was underway, the UN paid tribute in its charter to the principle of equality between nations. Recognition of this principle and a consequent process of democratization of international relations is the precondition for the introduction of elements of regulation into the state of nature that traditionally governs the relations between sovereign states. Except in urgent cases of self-defense, the use of force should be authorized by the Security Council. This is an important turn, but for this very reason, there are those who regret the good old days of the League of Nations, when it was the civilized, developed and wealthy countries, the great democracies, that decided. We are thus returned to another key point in the platform of the anti-war movement. Figures as diverse as Liebknecht, Tolstoy, and indirectly the late Gandhi, who stressed the principle of equality of all races as the basis of real peace, were in complete agreement on the need to fight chauvinism, branded as an integral part of the policy of war and aggression. How is chauvinism expressed today? It should at once be made clear that there is a difference between patriotism on the one hand and chauvinism and exclusivist nationalism on the other. Despite superficial similarities or assonances, we are dealing with two radically different orientations. The one is universalizable, while the other is not. Recognition and defense of the dignity and independence of a nation are perfectly compatible with the recognition and defense of the dignity and independence of other nations. By contrast, the category of master people or master race is manifestly not universalizable. A master people can only exist to the extent that there are other peoples destined for serfdom. Fortunately, with the fall of the Third Reich, this ideology has been consigned to history. However, the hierarchization of nations can take another form, albeit one not so crudely naturalistic. Nor is the category of God's chosen nation, summoned by him to lead the world, universalizable. A nation can be destined to lead only if there are others destined to be led. We are brought back to this theme, which is deeply rooted in the U.S. political tradition, when we see a group of countries arrogate itself to the right to decide sovereignty, if necessary outside and against the UN Security Council, on a punitive military expedition, or use of the weapon of mass destruction that is the embargo. This is the triumph of the chauvinism of which a particular civilization is the protagonist, one that clearly regards itself as invested with a higher mission, exempting it from the rules to which common nations are subject. It is true that the UN has not a few limitations. The pressure which the richest countries put on the poorer, as rotating members of the Security Council, on the occasion of important votes, brings to mind wealth's capacity for corruption and intimidation in the democratic process in capitalist society. But the pretension of a great power or great civilization to decide on its punitive expeditions in sovereign fashion is analogous at the level of international relations to a coup d'etat within an individual country. In this sense, democratic and humanitarian interventionism is the opposite of democracy and peace. The lesson of the First World War should not be forgotten. I mentioned it at the start of this book, but it is worth repeating. While the Entente assigned its armies the task of furthering democracy and imposing respect for universal values on Wilhelmine Germany, the latter allocated its army the task of furthering democracy and imposing respect for universal values on Tsarist Russia, which was an ally of the Entente. If there is a connection between democracy and peace, it is the connection that links peace to democracy in international relations. Historically, the anti-war movement has justifiably linked the struggle against the dangers of war with the struggle against chauvinism and for democracy in international relations. What is blocking or impeding the advent of the latter? Writing shortly before his death, Tocqueville noted with sadness the emergence of a new, disturbing phenomenon in the country so loved and admired by him. Quote, "For some years, a spirit of conquest, even rapine, had been manifesting itself in the United States." End quote. It was no longer simply patriotism, however irritable. In other words, the self-consciousness of a people proud of its history and its accomplishments. For the foreseeable future, at least, that sentiment stripped the idea of a world without national and state boundaries of any credibility. But it did not necessarily cause conflict. Even between proud self-consciousnesses, coexistence was possible. If it sometimes assumed an emphatic form, defense of the dignity of national individuality, as of empirical individuality, was universalizable. The case of the spirit of conquest, and even of rapine, which in and of itself implied conflict and war, was very different. How is the emergence of this spirit to be explained? Are we dealing with a permanent, insuperable anthropological characteristic? Highlighting its novelty in the United States, and developing his analysis in 1852, Tocqueville tended to historicize the phenomenon. It was no longer a question of expansion in the far west, engaged in by the colonists, to which he raised no objections. Now, something new was occurring. There had already been the war against Mexico and its drastic amputation. But the spirit of conquest, and even of war, was far from disappearing in the United States or the other advanced capitalist countries. Must a specific political and social system be implicated? Once again, we encounter a problematic that has been at the heart of reflection and political struggle in the contemporary era, and which is unavoidable, even if it must be confronted in radically new terms, overcoming any utopianism. One thing is certain. As long as the roots of the policy of conquest, rapine, and domination have not been torn up, the scourge of war may be contained and limited by an institution such as the UN. But the confident expectation on the part of Tolstoy and other great exponents of nonviolence, who saw the phenomenon of war and duels between states vanish from the historical stage, like the phenomenon of dueling between individuals, is doomed to continue to be disappointed. End section.